Welcome, everyone. Our topic today is the future of AI and the future of ethics, and how much control or influence we humans might have on these questions. This year, 2022, AI chatbots have produced some surprisingly impressive essays in response to philosophical questions. It seems likely that in the months and years ahead, successors to these chatbots are going to produce essays that are even more interesting, and over time, their answers might diverge from what we humans had previously thought were the best solutions. It may be similar to how AIs that play chess or play Go have over time come up with strategies and tactics that were different and better from what human experts had previously thought. Well, in the fields of ethics and morality, might AIs likewise produce answers that are different from, and perhaps better than, existing human philosophical systems? Our main ethical frameworks at the moment are often said to give humans a special priority. Taking care of humans is, in these frameworks, generally thought to be more important than taking care of insects, fish, birds, mammals, reptiles, robots, calculators, and so on. But will AIs agree? And looking further ahead, once AIs not only give opinions, but have the autonomy to carry out their intentions in the real world, will they be motivated to take care of human flourishing? Or will these AIs, with their alien reasoning and alien motivations, regard us in much the same way as we tend to regard colonies of ants? To discuss these and related questions, and to suggest what we should all be doing in 2022 and soon 2023 in anticipation of the rise of super intelligent AIs, I'm delighted to be joined by a number of people who have thought long and hard about these issues. We'll come in a moment to our main speaker, Daniel Faggella of Emerj Artificial Intelligence Research. But first, let's hear brief hellos and introductions from our two other panelists who will be providing comments and their own suggestions as the webinar proceeds. First, Rohit Talwar of Fast Future.
Hi, I think a few of you there know me, futurist based in London. Been working with David on some research around how society might adapt to AGI and what AGI could deliver, and just really fascinated to see what Dan's going to talk about and some of the thoughts he's going to share, and the conversation we're going to have that follows.
Thanks, Rohit. And now a few words from Bronwyn Williams of Flux Trends.
Yeah, first of all, I'm very privileged to be part of this conversation again. Thanks to David for inviting me back to share some thoughts. I think that when it comes to thinking about this topic of AI, I just can't help but think about how, when it comes to technology, anything that's sufficiently advanced is kind of indistinguishable from magic. But at the same time, how quickly that magic becomes banal or mundane or absolutely taken for granted. And there, of course, I can't help thinking about the Old Testament and the Israelites in there when they got manna that came from heaven to nourish them in the desert, and how amazing it was for the first few days, but very quickly they got to complaining about it and seeing what could be done better. And I think that those ideas are quite interesting. So I think any conversation around morality or ethics or what we should be doing with an artificial intelligence that could be, and in fact will become more powerful than us both individually and collectively, could do with framing that conversation a little bit in terms of how we have dealt with religion in the past. I think that when we think about it in practical terms, there's not much to distinguish between the two, and at least that's a helpful framework with which to start to open these conversations. I'll leave it there. I'm sure Daniel has his own ways of talking about the subject that are much richer than mine. But thanks again for inviting me back.
We'll come back to some of these themes, surely. But that brings us, to set the scene more fully, to Dan. Dan, please take it away.
Happy to do so. So I'm going to try to be very succinct here. I don't have a formal futurist background as some of our illustrious colleagues on the program, some of whom are my pals. My work, for the most part, is focused on the near-term implications of AI, but that does mean we get to talk to leadership at, head of AI at a Raytheon or a US bank, as well as the open AIs of the world and the Nick Bostroms of the world who've been on our show as well. So kind of connecting the dots from the near and far. Some of this has led consistently to a few themes of questions around AGI and ethics for me over the last 8 years or so, since running the program and kind of doing our research. So what I'll do, David, if it works for you, is I'll tee up kind of 3 very quick slides. I'm going to move very swiftly because I want to get into discourse and push back and forth on this stuff. But David, please let me know if this screen share is actually working for you, and I'll only need 3 of them. Is this up?
It is up. We see the whole screen, so that's fine.
Okay, easy enough. So I'll just got 3 here. I'll tear through, so I'll be as swift as can be, and then
No need to hurry. You can take your time if you feel
sure.
there's an important point that needs to be sunk in.
Some of them are important enough, but I think I've made them as succinct as makes sense to tee them up. So let's give it a crack. 2 things that I think come up repeatedly around this question of sort of ethics and artificial general intelligence over and over again. One of them is, what should the values be of such a system, of such an entity? Which implies on some level, what should we be doing to influence the values of such an entity that might be more intelligent, possibly more sentient than we are? So that's one question. A second question is, what are its values likely to be? And I think sometimes those discussions actually go in a slightly different direction. So I'll tee up 2 parts of this, which might hint a little bit at where I stand on some of these questions, but I'll just sort of unravel them here. So one of them, in terms of what should AI's values and ethics be, I almost think this is sort of a faux question, because this question answers itself depending on the end goal that somebody has in mind for AGI. So there are many humans, and I can't blame them. I think, we're all selfish in our own little way. I think there's many humans who would foresee an eternal Homo sapien kingdom for the next 3 billion years, 4 billion years. And that would imply that an AI system should value human lives, David, as you had kind of framed it, as sort of top of the heap, top of the food chain, if you will, and really ossify values to be something that fits with the hairless monkeys. So that would be sort of one option. And I think, again, that's a foregone conclusion, depending on what you think AGI should be for. I think there's very few people, at least who I've met, who are so reckless as to say an AI's values should just be whatever they end up being. Who would just say, let it rip. Who cares about humanity? Who cares about other life forms or what happens, so long as this thing pops off, so long as we get a nice fast takeoff, so long as we can blast beyond humanity. And I share the enthusiasm with ascending to higher forms, but certainly not with that level of recklessness. I think there's a bit of a middle ground, which in my opinion was framed very well in Ben Goertzel's Cosmist Manifesto, which for many reasons I think is sort of a very brave and stern look at these topics, which is the idea that there may be some ability for us to influence the grand trajectory of the development of such an intelligence, possibly by having some tenets and some values that we might hope it could optimize for. But we've got to be able to understand that at some time we're going to let go of the reins there, or just not have any understanding of what the reins even are anymore. And that thing will continue to attenuate and blast forth, as essentially all previous forms of life have since, the little lava pools where the single-celled thing started wiggling about. So Goertzel has growth, freedom, and joy as sort of those values. He says very frankly, and I appreciate this about Goertzel, that even those admittedly are arbitrary. And while even he himself values things like the lives of his children, he kind of embraces this notion that at some point there will be a level of transcendence whereby he won't really be able to be too emotionally attached to sort of what is valuable. So I think there's these gradations here. I tend to be an advocate more of the bottom. I'm not so hopeless as to think we have to stick in the middle. My current thought, David, is that the middle option of just let it rip possibly has undue risk for an Armageddon. And if you are a big fan of the ascension of sort of sentient forms, the destruction of all sentience and possibly having to restart from nothing again or from a much lower level is a very bad proposition. So I'm not an advocate for anything that would cause a total meltdown if it's at all possible. So 2 things about this. Number one, I would say I think ossifying human values is just vulgar and wrong for a variety of reasons. I think that setting the trajectory with some level of values may be futile. This idea of growth, freedom, joy, it may be so arbitrary and subjective on how to define those that it's useless, but it seems to me to be about as much of a middle ground as we can hope for if we advocate for something higher, and also want to be realistic. So I'll move to the second question. I'll be brief again here. What is an AGI's morality likely to be? I think this is actually, this is a really tough question. I think that it's probable that we have no real idea. Rodents would have done a very poor job predicting what we humans would care about, despite the fact that genetically, I don't know if we're 92% similar or something ridiculous like that, 78% similar or something like that. They would have done a pretty rough job of that. I think we're going to have a very tough time imagining the moral valuation of entities that are vastly beyond ourselves. There's a second point here that I think is important, and I hope we'll get to bandy about, and that is the idea that through the various and sundry growths and ascensions of an AGI, all of us on this call have seen how quickly AI has advanced in various fields over just the last 5 years, maybe the last 5 months, if we're honest. I think if anything close to that pace continues into the decades ahead, I think it's a bit of a silly notion that as an AI starts to develop ways of valuing things and moves forward in the world, it feels unlikely that as those ways of valuing evolve and bubble forth and change and adjust, as human values have as our society has advanced, that the one value that would remain the same through all of those transitions would be keep the monkeys happy. It seems unlikely that that would be a frozen value in the storm of values, the storm of ways of valuing all things that could be and are worth pursuing, that in that storm, the one unified singular floating item would be the happiness of the monkeys. It seems quite likely at some point in that storm, we are the ant pile to your analogy there, David. We are something analogously small, hopefully not hated, hopefully not tortured, but at some point probably, cast off. I think that's quite likely to be the case at some point. So the main thrust of the argument here is that I would agree with folks like Roman Yampolsky and others who would say that it's going to be pretty unlikely for us to be very, very important in the eyes of something that we really can't predict because it's astronomically more powerful than ourselves. I would go so much as to argue it is morally wrong to ossify hominid values into all permutations of the grand spires of form that may come after us, and that probably we need to carefully decide when the time is to hand over the baton, but fully understand, this might be controversial, I certainly am not dogmatically believing in this, but maybe understand that it's okay to hand over that baton at some point. I don't think we should rush it. I'm not an advocate for human suffering here, but that if there is something of astronomically higher intelligence and sentience, that maybe it not only should steer the future, but should rightly, in the utility monster sense, to use the rough analogy, sort of have more moral sway, frankly, than the hominids as well. And so let's not rush to that, but maybe understand that that would be the chasm we're crossing, and that would be the argument that I make. So I'm going to wrap up on that, David. I don't want to keep this thing focused on my slides the whole time, unless you've got any questions about what's on screen.
That's fine, thanks. I don't know if any of the four of us want to speak up for ossified values forever. I think many transhumanists and others look to humans being elevated in this process, so that we will keep some of our human characteristics that we love and cherish, but we will hopefully transcend many of the limitations, and we will be helped in that transcension by some elements of merger with the AIs. And so that it won't be AGIs that are leaving us in the dust and having little regard for us in our continuing current form, but ideally there will be AIs that are a little bit ahead of us in the journey and helping us to enhance and grow as well. Is that a scenario that fits with your predictions, Dan?
I really appreciate you opening this up. Yeah, I'm not a unbeliever there or an anti-advocate for that or something like that. I would say, so the best possible scenarios for life itself, I think, immediately blast beyond humanity in a vast and astronomic way. The best possible scenario for hominids, of which I am one, and I assume you guys are too, are, I think, the following. One, some kind of a mind upload where we get to hang out in a sugar cube in some vastly expansive, hyper blissful experience. It feels like a billion years, even if it's only 100. At some point, that little computing cube probably gets consumed by whatever the AI is to do something more useful than making me happy or making you happy. But I think that actually that's a hot ticket right there. That's a really good scenario. All things considered, I mean, compared to everybody else that's died, like straight dying, I think that's a pretty solid scenario. Second scenario that's pretty solid for humanity might be some level of merger. Now, the precise nature of this feels a little funky. I think that leveling up and some amount of merger, I would say we ought to strive for, very, very much so. It's not clear what would happen to the instantiation of our individual consciousness there. It's not quite clear to me what would happen there. It's also not quite clear if the merger would really make sense to whatever the amalgamated intelligence is. Like, would it be done out of kindness? Like, oh, I will permit you to merge because otherwise I'm going to leave you in the dust. Or would it be for some useful reason? If it be for the latter, I don't think everybody gets a nice fun time ride. And so, and I would agree with Kurzweil, as probably you would too, David, that eventually the non-biological probably trumps and obviously blasts beyond the biological at some point. This would be by presumption. I don't know about that. But yeah, I would say those two scenarios would be brilliant and wonderful. The specifics of the merger and if we're even still alive feels questionable, but potentially worth striving for. So I would say by all means, leave that door open. I see those as the two best things that we could hope for as hominids. I think life can hope for much more. As hominids, I think that's as much as we're allowed to hope for.
Bronwyn or Rohit, you want to dip into the conversation? Bronwyn, go for it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, particularly with regards to the halfway house between sort of humanity and sort of some sort of sentience, intelligence that we then merge with. The merger for me would be an unnatural equilibrium. But at the same time, humanity has been quite good at dealing with unnatural equilibriums, which is something that I talk about quite a lot. So I tend to look at the futures from more like a economics, politics perspective. And like two of the biggest ideas that sort of shape our human society at the moment are that of capitalism and democracy. And capitalism is a natural form of equilibrium. It's a kind of state of nature, whereas democracy is a very unnatural form of equilibrium, but it's an equilibrium that we have worked very hard and together, astonishingly, as a species to try and put into place. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But that for me would be that whole human AI merger. It would be an unnatural equilibrium, one that we would have to fight for and defend. It wouldn't be a natural state to tend towards. And that means it will always be unstable, just like democracy is unstable, because it's something that we are constantly working against nature to put into place. So the question there with the merger would be, how long could we hold that for before something breaks and you go towards a more natural sort of equilibrium? Which means definitely sort of some sort of transcendence beyond that, because why would a both sentient and intelligent sort of form of AI want to retain the very messy, as you've sort of termed it, the very flawed meat sack vessel that we carry around with us? I mean, it's very expensive to run the human operating system, right? So you have to kind of work beyond that. So I think the challenge is, how do you actually defend an unstable equilibrium? And the other question that I have for you, though, Dan, is this idea of intelligence without sentience and sentience without intelligence, which is also a scenario that I've been thinking about quite a lot, given that the current forms of AI that we are dealing with are very much middle of the bell curve forms of AI. This is AI that's looking at the vast intelligence of everything that humanity has to offer, and it's aggregating it and it's learning from it. And that means it'll be always better than the worst, but never as good as the best. So it's almost a homogenizing, flattening, almost, again, democratic form of AI that we are building at the moment, which is tending towards the middle. How do you see, in that case, that sort of sentience, but without real intelligence? Is that a plausible scenario, or how does artificial intelligence then break out of the mediocrity or the lowest common denominator, the averaging effect of our current forms of AI that we are seeing? At what point does that start to turn around? And is that directed by us, or is that directed by artificial intelligence itself, which is something that we haven't seen play out yet?
Yeah, I'll try to dip into all that very quickly. I think these are really good questions. So I wrote a piece called where do we steer sentience, or I try to answer this in as robust a way as I can. I think there is an argument that if you could tile the universe with feeling sentient stuff, even if it wasn't thinking very much, were it blissful, this would be a net good in sort of a grand way. I'm actually not horribly unsympathetic to that. I'm really not. I think the nature is kind of a pain machine, frankly, in many regards, and I think that it's actually not the worst case scenario. However, here's what I posit, and I don't know if this is right, but this is what I posit. I do think that if there was a grand intelligence completely void of sentience, my instinct is that this would seem to be a net ill in many regards. That said, I'm very open to the idea that there are things beyond the sentience that we currently understand that could be morally valuable. So think about it like this. At some point, there was nothing, and then there was like a wriggling protein. That's like a 0 to 1. Then at some point, there was no cellular life, and then there was a single cell. Then something had legs. What? Then something had eyeballs. Like those transitions happened where entire new, like, universes of value opened up. Senses. Light was now a thing. Light didn't exist until there was a thing that could sense it. So is there something similar to sentience? Are there things higher that we can't possibly conceive of that are morally valuable, that aren't like the monkey?
Like a branch, like a dead-end branch of the evolutionary journey. That's another question.
Yeah, I guess, and I think this could relate to evolution in general. I think my guess is like, so much value has exploded and bubbled up in the eyeballs of us hominids that has not exploded and bubbled up to crickets. Up at higher levels, more things are likely to bubble and explode. And so I would say it feels like the right move, if possible, to understand sentience and ensure that whatever populates the galaxy has a bit of it. Because by golly, if it was all darkness from here, that feels like a loss. However, the reason I don't advocate for tiling with dumb pleasure, the reason I don't advocate for tiling would be that I think we must explore the state space of value. And I think higher levels of intelligence and higher levels of capability will conceive of things more valuable than our petty values, which are good enough for now, good for Goertzel. I love what he did. Growth, freedom, joy. I mean, like, these are as good as I could ever think of. God bless him. But you know what? Like, when we're crickets compared to whatever the thing is, I'd rather go with those values probably. And so I guess that's the answer. I think tiling the world of pleasures, halfway decent, but I think it's fettering, because I think even sentience, this grand arbiter of moral value, things that aren't sentient aren't morally valuable, which I generally believe, I think that's limiting to our hardware and software. And so I would hope that we would have an explosion of blissful sentience along with intelligence, but that blissful sentience would not be the only moral value we optimize for, because my guess is there are higher, grander, farther ones, maybe kinds of meta-sentience of which we know nothing. And I would hope to discover those, just as you and I are pretty glad we discovered Zoom calls and we aren't rodents anymore. So that would be like the fast answer.
Rohit, any thoughts so far?
So many different points that I could respond to there. I'm just trying to order them. I want to pick up on the last one, actually. My overriding thought is that this is, again, a very interesting conversation being held by very intelligent people and almost irrelevant to most of the planet. If we look
that's why we're here, but yeah.
But Ben's 3 principles of growth, freedom, and joy, again, if you ask most of the planet, they would be down at the level of survival, safety, and waking up tomorrow. And I think somehow we have to kind of acknowledge that by talking about the relationship between humans and ants as our metaphor, we make it safe. If we start to talk about the real relationships on the planet today, it's the relationships between the few and the many. And already we have no moral framework of any value because we already treat a huge part of the population as though they are ants. We don't care about them. We don't allocate resources to them. We don't give them a say. They don't have access. They don't have opportunity. And we see some of the brutal things being done to them. So what I struggle with is given that that's our starting point, how we can evolve from here to a moral framework that represents the whole of the planet. And I'm going to have to go because someone's ringing on my doorbell, but I'm going to leave it there for a second and just say, I think we're going to have to think about quite radical shifts in the way we operate to get to new frameworks that are actually inclusive and that a much bigger proportion of society can take part in. And with that, I'm going to just disappear for 2 seconds and deal with whoever's at my door.
Sure. I just, in frankness, David, so I hopped on the call. I mean, I think there are conversations about what are we doing now, just to be really cold with you, brother. That's why I do 80 hours a week. So 80 hours a week, I'm focusing on the near-term aspects of AI. That's 80 hours of my week. So this is a conversation. My presumption was it's a conversation about the grand trajectory. So handling poverty today, put that on the table when we start the session, and I'll go right off on that with you, brother, you know. But that's, you know, so I'm with Rohit, although my presumption was we're kind of starting about, we're talking about like the grand poobah blossoming of intelligence itself. But if we want to go down to how we get there, I think that's cool too. I'm happy to do that.
Well, isn't there the risk that in due course, everybody in the world, the billions of people, are suddenly going to say, you guys, you knew this terrible thing could happen and you didn't inform us. So suddenly it's much worse than being poor and oppressed. It's suddenly everybody's facing oblivion because of the scenario you already discussed, that we let the software engineers rip. We didn't constrain them, and they're on the point of destroying the whole planet. And at that stage, the 8 billion people in the world are going to be very angry at the four of us because we had an inkling that this thing could have gone wrong and we didn't do something about it.
There's plenty of people talking about poverty and inequality. I think that's the bottom line. Not to say they're not important, not urgent. The urgent will always be among us, urgent issues of everything else. But I do want to challenge one point that Rohit made, saying that for the vast majority of people on the planet, they are concerned with issues of survival. I find that quite dismissive as someone that lives in a society that's highly unequal and also has a huge amount of poverty. And what we find very, very interesting is that for young people in particular, they are engaging with issues of meaning and with issues of meaning beyond the natural framework of life. We're talking about things like spirituality and religion and immortality on the far end, and also with meaning in the day-to-day existence of life. There is a huge pushback at the moment, particularly within youth communities here in South Africa. Again, a society dealing with vast amounts of inequality and poverty. They're not wanting handouts and their subsistence needs met. They are wanting those higher actualization goals and a right to actually participate in that, to the point that we have people that don't have a job refusing to take a job that is actually demeaning to them, which almost means that they are prepared to sacrifice those basic level needs for higher aspirational goals. And those high aspirational goals, talking particularly around meaning and about what it means to be a human being on this planet going forward. I don't think that's a privilege of the rich to contemplate mortality and what comes next. And mortality here, again, is an individual level and also as a societal level, which is what we're really talking about when we start to talk about the post-human transition or the interim steps that we have along the way, as the transhumanists would focus on. This is about immortality. It's about meaning. It's about what we are doing here. And I think that people are engaged with those issues. The challenge is, of course, that when we do talk about these things, you have to have a different lens when it comes to the important and the urgent. And you have to be balancing both those things at the same time. You can't throw away the important issues that are the very reason that we're here as individuals and as a species, again, in order to focus only on the urgent. If you focus only on the urgent, you get nowhere. Again, I speak as a South African sitting in the dark, and my quotes are 4 hours of power blackout for the day, right? If we constantly dealing with those issues, we will never get to think about anything else. And I think that we also have a right and a responsibility to think about those things, even if we do have urgent issues in our space. So I think these conversations are worthwhile, and not just worthwhile for the privileged. It's not just a privileged conversation, which is something that's also worth pushing back on. Quite often conversations around AI become very elitist, and this is partly because of the sorts of voices who have led the conversation being quite elitist groups, like the rationalists out in Silicon Valley, who do approach it from a very condescending, top-down, academic elitist, very sort of, jargony based perspective. And I think that sort of democratizing the conversation itself is probably a really valuable thing to be doing, and not at the exclusion of dealing with other pressing issues. It's actually all part and parcel of the same. So I hope I've sort of articulated my point there, but I think that we are having these conversations, even if we're not.
If I could just come back and sort of finish what I was saying when I had to rush off. Sorry if it came across as condescending. That was certainly not my intention, and I'm not suggesting that the whole of the planet is in poverty. I think the point I would make is, and I was trying to make, is that we have to have these conversations, and they're very important. But we have to think about, how do you open this conversation up? If you want to have a conversation about moral frameworks, then you have to think about how you make it more inclusive, when the priorities of a lot of the people you're talking to or you want to bring in are very different, and their needs and priorities are very different, and maybe their understanding of the technologies are very different, and the possibilities, even the ones that Dan outlined to us, I'm guessing that a lot of people wouldn't even know that those were the choices, or that those were considerations they have to make. And so for me, it's, I guess, and this is pretty much all the work I do, is around trying to bridge that gap between clever things that are happening and clever things that are being done, and helping a broader community understand them and say, well, how do we make choices in a world where some of these factors and forces are at play? And I think where I would go on this is that, yes, there's a huge risk that the machine, if you like, starts to set the framework and lets rip. And the question is, how do we get to the point where we can influence that? What is it we need to do, and how much of society and government and those in positions of power, how do we influence them, and how do we get them to the point where they acknowledge that, yes, it might be a good thing to control the machine? Because certainly if you look at investor behavior at the moment, there's a huge amount of money going into AGI and things that look close to AGI. And I don't hear much of that conversation about what kind of control would we have on it. I hear a lot of conversation about what kind of return on investment can we get from this, and how many jobs could we replace, or how much of human activity could be replaced. I don't hear that same conversation from investors. I don't know if you've seen the article on the front page of the Financial Times today, where Goldman Sachs are talking about taking out 4,000 heads simply to improve profits because they can replace them with AI. And so we're at a very interesting point in time where there's a risk that we have this conversation amongst a very, very small group of people, and we don't actually have the kind of impact we're talking about. And I think right now is, perhaps the more challenging piece of this is how you widen the conversation to bring a lot more people into it, so there's a lot more chance of having influence.
We'll come to Dan in a moment. I'll just summarize what I think I've heard, which is that there's two conversations. There's some people are thinking hard, what are the credible scenarios of the future? And then there's a broader conversation, which is, how do we involve others in our insight, and how do we also get their perspectives, which we may not be including, so that we don't even agree amongst ourselves what the key scenarios are. So that is what we're trying to do today, trying to get clarity on some of these key scenarios. But at the same time, we are trying to figure out how do we broaden awareness, not just awareness of these scenarios, but a passionate interest. So I think that's part of it. And I think your question is very good, Rohit, which is, people are all over the world wondering, how do they influence, quotes, the machine, which is capitalism, which is the large tech companies, which are sometimes behaving in ways that they don't fathom. And that questions we is likely to get worse because the machines are likely to be powered by more and more clever AI, and they'll be harder for us to influence. So Dan and then Bronwyn.
Yeah, sure. So I think, again, I think there's different starting points we could have come from, right? You could have said, hey, Dan, do you want to jump on and prepare some slides about, alleviating pain in the global south with AI or something? And I could have put together different slides for you, right? I'm presuming we're kind of starting at a higher level. But if we want to kind of talk about the connecting dots as well, happy to do so. I will say, in terms of how we influence these things, I think we should expect self-interest to reign. I think that when we see a company like an OpenAI, who I don't think are made up of any more devils than the government of South Africa or of London or whatever. I think they're made up of humans who, like most of us, would kind of do what a rational human would do in their shoes primarily. There are some devils out there. I don't think on the aggregate most people are. OpenAI primarily is really talking about expanding human creativity, yada, yada. Now, of course, there's huge risk for astronomical automation in this space. But the companies, we don't see primarily the companies talking about, bloodthirstily chopping off, humans from their economic well-being. Nor, now I haven't studied the circumstances of whatever organization we were talking about, Goldman Sachs or something, cutting 4,000 heads. I don't know the situation close enough in person, but I would say not every decision to downsize is born of evil. I think actually sometimes companies surviving another 10 years because they're not bloated is kind of a net good in many regards. And I definitely don't see sort of profitability as sort of like correlating directly to sort of like satanic levels of evil. So I think that's kind of wishy-washy there. But I think how do we bubble this stuff up so that influence starts to happen? My guess is there's two main parties here. So I think there's two games to play. So there's two main games, and then there's kind of side games. So the two main games are innovation and regulation. So the innovators, being the OpenAIs, the DeepMinds, the people that have a shot of birthing the deity, okay? So Google, Facebook, whatever. That's the best game in town, if we're going to be honest with it. I mean, that's the best game in town. You want to be building the thing. That's the best game in town. Now, the other game is the game of regulation, where primarily the way you gain influence and innovation is you just drive forward real hard, real fast. Now, you don't want to seem like you're looking for power. You want to give off the right signals, okay? But you want to build that capability as fast as you can, Bonaparte style. On the regulatory side, you want to talk about your virtues. You want to talk about how you're standing up for other people. You want to essentially take power from the innovators. But in a way, you have to do it just like the innovators. You have to do it under an umbrella of some kind of a moral cause that other people could believe in. So the innovators have to say, we're here to have creatives have a better life, right? And the regulators, they're going to try to control open AI. They're going to say, well, we're doing this to help share the economic, whatever. They're going to come up with something, right? Robespierre came up with reasons. Bonaparte came up with reasons. They're shooting at the same ball game. So I think those are the two parties. And I think the way we come to a middle ground where there is some sort of crescendo birthing of sort of an AGI where we can actually influence its values amidst that unequal equilibrium or whatever Bronwyn had brought up there. I like the analogy. The way that those shifting wrestling powers, and that's just in the West. China's going to be doing its own ball game. That's a whole nother conversation. And I think there's a reason to put the pedal to the metal, if nothing else, just because Maoist approved AGI virtual reality is a worse place to live than whatever the hell Zuckerberg's thinking of, my opinion. But yeah, so that's just happening in the West. How, to Rohit's point, I think this is a very valid point, which is why I think the value determination may be futile. Where in that flux do we say, okay, cool, we've imbued it with these values that are beneficial to humans? I think it might be optimistic to think that's even possible. I think regulation, innovation, hopefully that wrestling match is like productive and there can be some ability to steer things. But I think mostly whoever has the most influence is going to steer it mostly where they want to go. And that's not an optimistic view, but I think that's the world we're working with. And I would see optimizing that ugliness as good as we've got.
Bronwyn.
Yeah, just a sort of point on if we do actually get to a point of actual artificial intelligence that is superior to our own, when it comes to defining that moral framework, it almost becomes an exercise in futility. And the regulation too, it's an interim step. It's an interim step along the way. It's that unequal equilibrium, but it's us all pretending that we still have some actual direction over what comes next. Because from my perspective, the sort of positive scenarios, positive not in the sense of good or bad, but positive in the sense of absolute, that come about when it comes to the moral framework. If you extend your horizon far enough, you've kind of got two paths. So one is the consensus, as Adam Pantanowicz, which some of you might be familiar with, he was involved with the Brain Internet Project, spoke about quite a lot. And the consensus would be that essentially the moral framework comes from essentially being a kind of real-time democracy, a basic sort of consolidation of everybody's moral views on any particular issue at any given point in time. So you think about direct democracy taken to the nth, which is again that sort of that low bar kind of complete. It's the bottom line average about what everybody kind of wants, which is a kind of dumb ultimate intelligence. That would be a one path, which as you've spoken about, probably wouldn't be the best one, because even our best ideas have not been particularly good so far. The lowest common denominator is unlikely to be any better than that. And the other sort of absolute scenario is that it actually transcends us, whether that's through additional intelligence or intelligence plus sentience, in which case our moral frameworks and the hubris that we have in developing in such nudges for such an entity that it's superior to us are completely irrelevant. So when it comes to including people in these conversations, I think it is actually an absolute lie. We are telling people that their contribution in any way more than their sort of vote, which could be sort of just summed up as being a very small drop in the whole sort of collective consciousness, that whole consensus bucket, that's about all the say that we are going to get, no matter how powerful your activist group is or whatever politician wins in space. And it's almost be doing people a disservice in allowing them to think that we have some sorts of a say, actually, in what happens here. We kind of have a say along the way, but not necessarily towards the end point. And then also coming back to in a slightly different direction in terms of those interim points that we're going to go to along the way, coming back to the issue of AI and jobs, which I think is a very big conversation at the moment. And even just ChatGPT-3 is going to wipe out a whole lot of jobs that we've got. But I think that, again, we're doing ourselves a massive disservice if we are making regulations and making choices to defend jobs, which is an arbitrary thing anyway. Best case scenario for the masses or for most people on the planet along the way to whatever end path we end up in is actually a world post jobs, where at least for a couple of years or months, while the intelligence is deciding what to do with all of us, we get to kind of enjoy some of the fruits of the garden of good and evil that we've put together without having to grind through a 9-to-5 job. That would be the best case scenario to kind of accelerate towards. And in fact, that's something that's being pushed by people on all sides of the political spectrum as a low bar kind of a utopia to look forward to. But this idea that we can hang on to jobs in this sort of environment is, I think, another very dangerous idea. If we're telling people, all we're doing is sort of kicking that can down the road and setting people up for more disappointment and more resentment when ultimately those functions do fall away. If we're going to be useful in the interim as futurists, when we're working with corporate clients, we should be preparing people for a post-job, but still value-adding and value-trading future. We have to get these ideas shifted. Otherwise, we are really going to set ourselves up for very, very difficult couple of years ahead.
So the time to have the say is now. If we wait until AI is more powerful, if we wait until whatever companies are creating AI are dominating the world even more than they are now, it's too late. So what are we going to do in the short term? What are our actions that can steer things to increase the probabilities of success? Rohit and then Dan.
Well, just picking up on Bronwyn's point about jobs and AI, I think it's a critical one, isn't it? That these things are all interwoven. So when we talk about a moral framework, we also talk and the ethics around these things. They have to be wrapped up in everything else in society. And today we live under a capitalist framework where people are encouraged to have jobs. That's how they earn money. And there's a reward to those who invest and who employ. One of the things that AI starts to do is to decouple that notion of employment from capital gains, if you like, and we become more and more productive with less and less people. So it starts a whole new conversation about, well, what does the shape of society look like? And if we are moving to a life where we'll have a lot more leisure, then how do we prepare people for that? How do we help people understand that work isn't the ultimate goal, and that the goal of the universities or the education system is not to turn out economic units of production, but it's to turn out self-managing individuals who are fully self-realizing. And so all of these things end up being wrapped together, and it feels like we're at the point where somehow we need to catalyze some grand conversations. I don't think it's enough, as Bronwyn says, to just have a very narrow and limited conversation about regulation. I don't think it's enough to just have a conversation about job retraining. I don't think it's enough to just have some very clever people come up with possible moral frameworks for different scenarios. I think we do have to have that bigger conversation, and I think we have to start it in small ways, in a sense. We have to get smaller communities together, having that conversation about all these elements, raising people's understanding, and then having more informed conversations about it. And by smaller communities, I don't only mean governments, I mean business leaders, I mean church communities, local government. We're doing something with one of the local governments in the UK where the people are genuinely, the population is the poorest, I think, poorest borough in London, if not in the whole of the UK. And they can't, at the moment, get people having a conversation about the future because they're worried about heating bills, they're worried about food, they're worried about jobs. And again, the risk is that the urgent does drive out the important. So we're creating whole new mechanisms for that dialogue that allows them to talk about those things and then create space to talk about what's next, so you don't just perpetuate this near-term crisis. And I think it's not one answer. I think it's lots of smaller conversations that have this mix of education, understanding, broad discussion, and a willingness to hear multiple perspectives. And there isn't someone coming and telling them that they have the answer, and it's just a case of everyone else getting on board. And I think that's one of the risks that we face as futurists in particular, is that we all believe that we have the right answer, and the purpose of the exercise is to get people on board with our answer. And I think we probably have to get a lot more humble and see ourselves as in the role of facilitating the conversation more and bringing to bear the insights and processes to have that kind of dialogue, rather than being convinced that our job is to tell people the answer.
One thing we can do as a facilitator is say, how about this, or something like this, or what would you think about its limits? And I think, as you've said, Rohit, we have to help people to see beyond what's currently on their minds. We have to show them the possibility of post-jobs, a world of more leisure, but we have to paint it in a credible way. And if you think about it, then it's, well, if this happens, if AI is this powerful, what's it going to do next? So Dan, what's your suggestions here? What do you recommend we do now, here and now? Or should we put more effort into clarifying the longer term future end goals?
I think there should certainly be attention paid to both. I think that, as I mentioned before, the Goertzel scenario feels like it would be nice. It also may be impossible. So that's been my stance. I do think that what David is doing in this whole meeting is hopefully facilitating multiple people to have discussions, none of whom, at least thus far, as far as I can tell, are outlandishly dogmatically trying to convince the universe of what they're talking about. So hopefully this discussion is a microcosm of banding about ideas and figuring out which ones could be viable. And I think that that's a useful exercise. I do think at the end of the day, if any of us four are here to say, like, well, what could we do to sort of potentially influence the values of such a system? I think, in cold frankness, one would be running a company that's developing super hardcore AGI with billions in the bank. That would be a very strong position to influence things, much better than, let's say, a webinar. Although I do like this stuff, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for what David does. The other would be, amass some gargantuan amount of political power and sway through the proletariat or whatever other means. And sort of be able to leverage and wield that and new ways to govern and monitor and manage and bend the innovative efforts of the companies that are going to build the thing. So really, like, how do we influence it? Well, you kind of got to sit in one of two chairs, really. I think you could go down to the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, and you could ask them what they think if artificial general intelligence should tile the world with dumb sentient bliss or not. There is a place for that. I'm not sure I'm the guy. But I do think at the end of the day, if you want to steer the ship, there's something to be said of grassroots that I don't think should be written off. But it does seem quite clear: ascend to positions as high as you can, either in the space where the innovation is going to happen or where the regulation is going to happen. And there will be some outside of the political mechanism groups that end up having that kind of sway. But I think, David, that's probably the only game in town. Maybe what we're doing right now is a third thing, which is put some good ideas out there, hope that some of those people in those powerful positions latch onto them. But it does feel like the direct road is climb one of those spires. I don't really know if I've got an awesome answer outside of that. I think the world is going to continue to be competition.
We have so many comments in the chat, which we're not going to be able to do proper justice to, but let me feed in at least one from Ted Kahn. It says, why aren't we going back to Doug Engelbert's focus on augmenting human intelligence, indeed augmenting collective human intelligence, so we're able to have better conversations? And if we do that, maybe we should avoid AIs being sentient, and there will be a kind of merger, but it'll be a merger in which we humans have the sentience, we humans have the autonomy, and we use AI to, is it like a spell checker, but a better spell checker, something that can come up with better arguments, and then we decide. So should we do that? Maybe Dan, and then Bronwyn, and then Rohit.
Sure. I think there's a version, so like the steampunk world is like an analogy that I have here, where it's like, oh, everything's like the future. We all have jetpacks and stuff, but it's all made of like cast iron, and it's all like really, kludgy and funky. Like I would say, I don't think the idea is necessarily laughable. I think that the instinct for humans is to want to protect the other hominids, and hominidness is the most important thing to hominids. And so I get the instinct. I definitely get the instinct. I think Rohit brought up the point of like, what futurists are selfish about kind of pushing forward their idea. I think that can certainly be the case. I think there's a meta idea, which is that the bipedal like hominids are a pretty big fan of only looking for sort of the good in bipedal hominids. I'd say if the goal is sort of the perpetuation of hominidness as far as we can perpetuate it as close to the form it's in, maybe in slightly higher forms, but still have like human values, human emotions, whatever, that would seem a viable trajectory. If the goal would be blooming into the universe, maybe ascending as going as high as we can in terms of insight, in terms of capability, in terms of our sentient range, all of those things, David, that I mentioned that are probably beyond our conception in terms of new kinds of good, grand, vast kinds of good, as far beyond our kind of good as, let's say, somebody's pet hamster, like our values are beyond a pet hamster. I think if that's the goal, then it wouldn't make as much sense. So there's probably a lot of humans that are going to want to freeze things and keep it as hominids forever. There's others that might be okay with augmentation. I'm certainly in the camp that the blossoming of intelligence, sentience, capability, and the discovery of the good is a higher aim, and for that reason wouldn't advocate that humans be sort of the base of the operating system. I think this stuff is a really weird central sludge to kind of run a super intelligence off of. I advocate for merger. I told you the two best scenarios I think we can hope for, but I certainly wouldn't advocate to fettering ourselves to hominid, ultimately lizard brain stuff kind of being the bases of the grand intelligence. I think given my end goal, I wouldn't advocate for that, but that's my take. So I'll stop there.
Any comments, Bronwyn?
Yeah, again, I'd say that's probably more of a sort of an interim step to wherever it is that we're heading. And I'd also argue that if we were to look at the future from the vantage point of the past, if we were to go back a couple of decades and look forward, that's kind of already the future that we have. Again, we tend to not appreciate these things because once we have been exposed to magic, it's no longer magical to us. But what we kind of have with our current version of the internet and the current versions of the AI machines that are being put out into the public domain right now this year, that's what we kind of have, this collective intelligence based on the networking of all of us together, as flawed as we are. And quite frankly, you know, it's not a utopia to look forward to, is it? Right? I mean, like, this is kind of what we got to understand, that we're going to get more of that. That'll be on a small sort of normative point on where we're going there. But I think that these conversations always need to be quite honest if we are to be useful as futurists, so people that look ahead, in trying to separate the sort of positive scenarios, positive again in terms of what is likely to happen or what is actually seemingly inevitable when you start to follow down the chain of logic in the far, far future, and separating that from what is desirable, because we tend to kind of conflate both of those two conversations at once, and then we have lots of arguments that go absolutely nowhere. I think that the sort of bitter or exciting pill to swallow, depending on what your personal values are, is that what Dan is talking about are really inevitabilities when you have to sit with it and you have to think about it. Those end goal scenarios that he is depicting are not his personal preferences. These are not stories that he would like to happen necessarily, but rather these are realities that we have to confront. And then the sort of more interim conversation is, of course, what we want along the way. And there we can shape and guide those things. And there, of course, we have to be quite careful about pushing our own agendas and putting our own preferences into those mixes. But I think that we do also have to be quite realistic about what can hold, what centers can hold far enough ahead, given the assumption that artificial intelligence will become smarter than us collectively. And I think that we're not necessarily being honest enough about those conversations. that would be probably my biggest takeaway from what Dan is saying now.
Any quick comments, Rohit?
It is fascinating, isn't it, when you just picking up on these points, that we have all these interim stages, and at some point we have to engage politicians in particular in understanding that regulating for ChatGPT-3 is not regulating for the future of AI or the direction of travel. And you might be horrified by how far ChatGPT-3 is ahead of your understanding, but we need to take you much further. And there I wonder now, we have this all-party group on AI of politicians, and their conversations are kind of frighteningly dull and not very far-reaching. And so I think we need to find models, and I know Singapore's doing a lot more on this. Funnily enough, Dubai has its Minister for AI. And there are parts of the world where they're beginning to have much more meaningful conversations at, if you like, the highest level of government about these things and the direction of travel and where they're going, and what would constitute a good outcome for society, however you want to conceive it. I think we need more of those conversations as well, about what would constitute a societal good, that however it was delivered and whatever the balance between humans and AI in the future, we still had a sense of what we thought was good for society, even if that meant, well, we didn't exist in physical form anymore. We only existed as some kind of intelligence in another medium. We need to have those bigger picture conversations. I keep coming back to this because I feel like we can't get to this point of a moral framework. We can't get to this point of ethical guidance unless we extend the group of people who get involved. Otherwise, it's us talking to each other with great ideas and really powerful insights, but having minimal impact on those who can do anything with it. And
so here's a suggestion from the chat from Eva Pascal. She says, and it plays to your point, Rohit, how can we have a better and bigger conversation? She says, can we look ahead to ChatGPT helping to have a better conversation? Her point is that today, when we try to have an ethical agreement between people from different camps, or perhaps people from different nationality, Russians, Chinese, Middle East, fans of capitalism, fans of regulation, we often fail to have a conversation. But maybe in the not too distant future, AIs will actually come up with new language. Language is going to make everybody say, you know what, you understand what I'm trying to say, and you evidently understand the other guys too. Is that a credible scenario in the near future, that maybe these Zoom conversations will be supplemented by Chat GPT, version 4 or 5, sitting in the corner, summarizing it much better than I'm doing? Any thoughts on whether that's credible, or is that just naive, fanciful thinking?
Absolutely credible. What would be interesting would be, what are all the other things it's thinking about and working on at the same time, as this almost being its kind of side hustle. So what's its core activity that it's doing?
Yeah, well, it's not good enough yet, but it may get good enough before long. Dan?
Yeah, two things come to mind immediately, I guess. I would suspect that technology like Chat GPT, which will surely expand, drastically from here in just the next, year and a half, will be used hopefully for some applications to foster collaboration. And there's kind of whole schools of thought and sort of even professions based around facilitating these really hard conversations, and political adversaries where there's wars and things like that, and drug warlords and whatnot, being able to sort of sit people down in the same room. There's books written about sort of this facilitation done well, and being able to find middle ground and kind of stop conflict. And I think that's very worthy stuff. It wouldn't surprise me, and in fact it would be nice to see if AI could help with that. It seems absolutely self-evident that AI will also be used viciously in the opposite camp. Like, it seems so patently, ridiculously self-evident that it will also be used viciously in the opposite camp. So lovely if it can help us with a bit of cooperation, but clearly people have their own interests. And if they can wield automated social media bots, or the writing of some political treatise, or whatever else, put words in somebody else's mouth, whatever else they can do to further their own aims, as sentient things do, I think we're going to see it used there too. So I'd say it's possible. It's not part of a grander utopia, I don't suspect, because all of the other things will occur as well. Another thing floats to mind a little bit here that I'll just put on the table about that point, which I think is a very interesting point. I think it was at an in-person event, so I don't even know if I have an essay to point to or something, but Stephen Wolfram had this interesting idea once of sort of one of the ways AI might take over, quote unquote, is if it becomes sort of the facilitator and recommender of almost everything we're doing, to the point where we believe in it even more than our volition. Like, its choice around how to answer this email, about the food to buy, about how to allocate our week, they're just better. They're better for our productive goals. They're better for our well-being. They're better, to the point where we should let go of volition for a huge percentage of what we're up to. And I think if dialogue can get to that space, that might be a part of that gobbling up that could occur. I haven't thought through that scenario enough. I really hope to be able to write an essay on that at some point, but it dawned on me that if our hard conversations were through this weird AI mold, and they always had to happen that way, that could be another part of that creeping dynamic. Bit of a sideshow there, but I think it's a good point.
It reminds me of something Jamie Bartlett, one-time London Futurist speaker, works at Demos. He also used the term moral singularity, I think in a slightly different way, but he had the same notion that we would become more dependent on AIs to take decisions on our behalf, and we would stop ourselves being able to take these decisions, because we would have our moral guidance atrophy and our difficult decisions, because we're not practicing anymore. And then when the machine is going to recommend something bad to us, we won't be able to tell anymore. Whereas if we were still practicing all the time, we would be better placed to intervene.
And that's the whole stratum, though, isn't it? So Socrates was saying, we shouldn't have written language because everybody's going to forget how to remember things. And Emerson was talking about how, we've got a watch in our pocket and a bill of exchange, but we don't know how to navigate by the stars anymore. We don't know how to build a boat. I think that there's a gradation of that, right? There's things that every generation, more and more, obviously it's quite obvious, David, technology is a ladder and it's a crutch. So it's a crutch, some muscles are going to die, but it's a ladder, we're going to be able to get more stuff done. I guess the question is, where do we want to stop there? Maybe what this futurist was positing is that as we start to, as some of our moral decision-making atrophies, maybe that would be a place where the latter is no longer good. Is this his supposition?
I think he was just alerting people to a risk that we might sleepwalk into.
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly viable risk, and I think we're going to be atrophying stuff faster and faster and faster moving forward.
Bronwyn.
Yeah, I suppose on that point, in terms of sort of evolving beyond our personal morality, whether that is a bad or a good is also quite amoral, isn't it? Right? Especially if we're framing it in the context of this conversation, our ideas of morality are clearly flawed, both individually and collectively. We've made some pretty horrible choices for ourselves and for everyone else. So there's a pretty good, greater good argument. Again, I'm not advocating for it, but to be made that evolving beyond requiring personal morality might actually solve a lot of these problems. It would certainly make this entire conversation irrelevant, which is what I'm increasingly thinking about when it comes to framing the far futures of AI, how absolutely irrelevant so many of the issues that are so core to our sense of our identity and our sense of justice right now could become in the future. And I'm not sure we are prepared for that conversation, that almost everything we are talking about could be rendered irrelevant, as important as it feels for us right now. And again, not advocating for that, but positing that's probably the sort of the subtext, the kind of elephant in the room around these conversations. Is any of this going to be relevant? Should the ideas that we have, or that you certainly have written about enough, Dan, have with regards to the actual power and trajectory of what we have built and are unleashing and us quite quickly losing control. I think for most people, we've already far lost control of where this is going. There's very few people, as you alluded to, that actually still have any sort of control as to where this goes in the future. And many of those people that do have that small degree of control are not controllable by regulators. I mean, this is something that can be run with if you've got enough capital and enough intellect and enough computing power of your own. Anyway, so I'm not sure
Let's discuss regulators. Let's discuss regulators. There's a comment from Robert Whitfield a while ago in chat, just sent to the panelists. He says, it's a bit challenging. He says, I found Dan's depiction of the regulation stakeholder disturbing. I found it a distorted caricature. There may be some people like that who are exerting power for their Machiavellian reasons. That's my addition to his comment. But there is such a thing as responsible regulation, and that is what we should be aiming for. I know Jerome Glenn, who's on the call, has made the point in the past that we did manage to regulate partially the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials around the world. And that has been relatively good. We have avoided having a third world war. So there is a role of regulation. So what do you think is reasonable for us to try and do with the regulatory framework? Or will AI just emerge regardless of what we try to do? Dan?
I want to, so just to be clear, so I know Jerome Glenn relatively well and respect the guy's work as well. I think the point, so the Machiavellianness that I painted in the regulator, if you'll notice, was no different than the Machiavellianness I painted in the business person. For some reason, that one bothers nobody. The regulator, it bothers many, many people. I think it's particularly bothersome if you see yourself in that camp and you see yourself as morally good. I happen to think everybody's just running the Conatus. The Spinozan Conatus is the king of kings, and the sort of perpetuation of whatever is in our self-interest is kind of the name of the game, and that we should, nobody's got the saint crown on. So what I would say is regulators aren't bad, no more than entrepreneurs are bad. It's just they're moving forward in ways that make sense for that behooves their own interests. I'm sure some of them are good-hearted, just like there's plenty of entrepreneurs, for crying out loud, who are good-hearted. So there's no painting of evils here. If anything, I paint for no devils and no angels. I paint for the Conatus because I believe it is the truth. So I would say, number one, certainly not putting shade on the regulators. What I would say, the thing about the regulation camp that's a little tougher than the entrepreneurial camp is that they often more blatantly cloak themselves in virtue. to which I tend to resist personally because I abhor appearances. And so the sort of carrying the banner of moral good in sort of a that feels sketchy to me, and I have just a bit of a personal aversion to it on occasion. But I would say I'm not against regulators. I think both these powers have to exist, and I think they're the only names of the game. To Bronwyn's point, and Bronwyn, if you disagree with this, please let me know. But I think what you're touching on, which I'm very I concur with, is that does any of this conversation matter? Again, my position was very clear. It'd be great if we could inculcate values. We may not be able to. And unless we're at the top of one of those two spires, probably doesn't matter anyway. Chipper away all you want. Tweet away all you want. Get on the top of one of those spires or get off. That's literally what I think the name of the game is. So I'm very much there. I'm not deluding myself in the value of this conversation even so much. Although I do think that these conversations can bubble up to important things. That said, David, last thing I'll close on regulation. I'm not an expert in nuclear anti-proliferation, but I have some familiarity there. It feels more than warranted. I do think that there's all kinds of regulation around, let's say, financial crime, for example, in the AI space. If I think about my day job, a lot of where AI is making a difference in banking is detecting if this is something that should have been blocked by a sanction, is figuring out if this is actually a terrorist group. By golly, that's useful as heck. Financial crime is one of those things that no bank is going to stop by themselves. If I'm Deutsche Bank, do I really care? If I get my cut on that transaction, do I really care what it's funding? Not when I have payroll to make, but regulation ensures that that we have to be responsible for that or we're going to get slapped. And so I would say, by golly, may there be a blooming room for regulation, but let's also see it quite frankly. It's a pillar of power right next to innovation in terms of who runs the damn world. And like, it's one of those two pillars. So yeah, all for it, but I'm not going to call it saintliness and call entrepreneurship evil. I'm just not going to do that. So that's my clarification.
I think the argument is we should be looking for saintly regulators and saintly business people. Rohit and then Bronwyn.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see some models emerge, though, of regulators getting that in order to have smart, forward-looking regulation, you need a level of understanding that you're never going to get from just talking to the industry about what it's doing. So in the UK, for example, the financial services regulator is regularly creating sandboxes, whether it's for fintech or for crypto, and it's deliberately putting a looser set of regulations around new startups because it's saying they're the ones who are going to innovate. And when we see what they're doing, and we see what could be created, then that allows us to create smarter regulation. They're also now starting to encourage much more rotation of people from the industries they're trying to regulate into the regulator itself to provide resources and to work with them in smarter ways, because there's no way a regulator with 200 people can regulate an industry with, infinitely more resources and tens of thousands of people. The only way you can do it is in partnership and by having some sight of the kind of innovation that's coming next. So I think there are models coming through. I think inevitably a lot of regulators will be using AI to regulate AI and to monitor what's being done. It's pretty much the only way you're going to be able to assess all the products coming to market in fintech or in any space, and to assess the potential impacts of it. I think you'll see lots of very smart regulatory simulations being created using AI to test out how certain new products, new services that are being created, to test out how they might play out. So I think that there will be some innovation this year, in the next few years. The other thing, just going back to Ben's point about having our entire lives curated by AI, or that kind of risk or possibility. I've never heard so many people talking about new technology as I've heard in the last 6 weeks of people talking about ChatGPT-3 at social settings. And no one is against it. Everyone is really excited about the possibility of how it could save them time, how it could give them all sorts of new information, how it could speed up the writing of reports at work. And so it's going to be very interesting. I think this next year is going to be a very interesting one to see how society starts to relate to something you might call a generalized AI rather than AGI itself. And it might change our attitudes as well to the way we think about regulating, the way we think about creating moral frameworks, when we actually start to see that interaction at a mass level.
So the public is starting to change its mind on things that previously it hadn't given much attention to. Bronwyn, do you want to chip into this conversation?
Yeah, I suppose the one thing that I've been thinking about is that, again, in terms of contemplating our future mortality as a species, I think quite an interesting one to think about, again, sort of thinking a bit further down the line. We are uncomfortable with the idea of our own physical mortality on the individual sense, but I think most of us do acknowledge that it is not just a possibility, but it's an inevitability. At a more societal level, I think we're not quite there yet, right? So we sort of take comfort in the fact that although we might be mortal, our society as we know it will sort of continue on, and we've been a part of that. So in some way, whether it's through our contribution, through our work, or through having children, whatever the case is, that we kind of part of that societal immortality. And I think it's really, really difficult for us to start to acknowledge that this might not continue on many generations into the future in the format that we have it right now, that things are going to change. So I think that's also a conversation that's worth having. And again, this comes back into a much softer space, right? So many of these conversations around AI and all the rest of it about economics and politics and the geopolitical games that go on along the way. But I think the bigger conversations really are the very human ones, those ones that, again, center on ideas of meaning and what it is to be here and what it is to be working towards. And those questions in turn will shape whether we choose to work to bring this to fruition, work with or against the machine, whether we want to define what comes next or we want to resist and rail against it. But I think we need to be prepared also for some raging against the dying of the light as we know it, even if that light will be replaced by something brighter. Anyway, these are things
we
that
might get huge raging against the possibility of that dying of the light. And arguably, a lot of what's motivated politics recently is people raging against the, what's the phrase, status dissonance. They felt that the world owed them a better, they were promised a better future, and they see strange immigrants, they see people in foreign countries, they see elites with strange names apparently doing much better, and they're raging against it, understandably. And if they see the possibility that in a couple of generations, technology will have extinguished most of what's important to humans, maybe that's going to be...
Job, guys.
Say again?
Not just your job, people, right?
Not just your job.
Yeah.
I want to come back to the two spires, because what Dan said earlier has been on my mind. He said that if we really want to influence this, we have to either become a very successful leader of an AI company, or we have to have a strong political power with these two things. Aren't there other models? Haven't philosophers sometimes changed the world? I'm thinking of Nick Bostrom. His book, Superintelligence, was read by Bill Gates and by Elon Musk and by Sam Altman, now head of OpenAI, and has had some influence. When I think about economists, what changed the world in the 1980s, and since the 1980s has been this flood of neoliberalism, which came out of the work of people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. And for a long time, their ideas were going nowhere. And eventually, when the wind blew the different way in the 1970s with hyperinflation, people picked up these ideas. So I want to make the case that think tanks, futurists, philosophers, could change the world. And out of this conversation today, there might be one or two snippets of true profundity, which will end up on the desk of Joe Biden or Xi Jinping or Sam Altman or whoever, and might make them change their mind. So do you guys have such an optimism, or are we just deluding ourselves here?
I'd say
oh, go ahead.
definitely feeds into like Dan's thesis, right? I mean, like it's still being part of one of those two spires, either as through the consultant, through the world of corporate, or it's through the lobbyist or the think tank or the public intellectual that nudges the hands that sort of nudge the regulator. You still have to work within those two spires of power. I mean, like I definitely see myself as being kind of a court jester. You get the odd opportunity to talk truth to power in both of those forts, right? At the sort of public sector or the private sector level. And that's where you use the influence that you have, not mistaking that you don't hold the power yourself, that rather you do have the opportunity to be the flea that bites the tail that wags the dog, right? That's
I concur, David. So look, I certainly I think in Rohit's spirit of humbleness, I'm speaking about sort of with very stark language here around where the real game is. I mentioned that I did mention there's side games. And I do think, to Bronwyn's point, I mean, there's many thinkers that have molded my thoughts in a major and substantial way, to whom I'm massively grateful, and who I believe have influenced others as well. I think that if we expand out, David, to your point, I'll grant credence to many kinds of thinkers. You know, philosophers, economists that you mentioned, the think tanks of the world, I think is a trajectory. I think that there are some grassroots movements that end up putting some, you know, housing crisis issue or something now more on a political radar than it was before. And that's a whole nother category of thing. I think there are novelists that in some way, shape, or form, maybe a little bit more abstract, but have found some way to weave some issue in somewhere. I would say, whatever the heart of points. So if you don't want to be a politician or a business person, I say be a philosopher if you want to. And I have tremendous respect for that. But to Bronwyn's point, I will bring it back. I think in order to make your impact, you're going to have to feed it up through one or both of those pillars. So I call them the main games here. And I do think that the most direct influence is to be as high as you can on one of those two pillars, end of story. But if you can get your ideas, you get your little memes to climb their way up those pillars, good on you. It might be more likely for you than actually winning political races, in which case that's the power game you should play because you're not suited to do the others. Or maybe that's just your preference. And I think that's respectable as well. So I'll give credence to it, and I'll give credence to what Bronwyn said about, well, it's kind of got to fit into, it's got to fill those stems up if it's going to make the impact that we hope it will.
I want to raise one final point, which some of my former colleagues have been stressing to me. They say that we're still playing a very dangerous game here. If we're thinking in terms of there are beautiful things that the AIs might do in the future. They might reach higher levels of sentience, higher levels of consciousness that we can hardly imagine. That'll be good. Let's encourage it. Let's not stand in their way. And some of my former colleagues say this is extremely dangerous thinking, because who knows what these creatures will do. They may reach new levels of consciousness, but if we hand over all power to them, they could destroy all that we value, and that's too much to give away. So we should not be complacent about this. We should be saying, let's avoid any risk of handing over the baton until we are much more sure that the outcome will be one in which we can flourish, not in our present state, but in a transcended, elevated humanity plus or human 2.0 state. So we should not be just hoping that the AIs will do something wonderful. We must be much more sure to get the initial conditions right. Any responses?
Well, I guess it depends on who you're talking about as the we there.
And there is a comment in YouTube saying there is no such thing as we.
Yeah. So I think if you're we, the developers, then you really don't want anyone to stop you, not because you're evil, but you just want to push it as far as you can. You're in a competitive race with others in the AI field, and you want to be the first to break each new boundary. If you're
But some developers actually want regulation, because they say they would prefer not to do certain things, but if the regulation isn't in place, then their competitors will do it. So sometimes the developers will say, let's get agreement on standards, let's get agreement on monitoring and surveillance to stop people breaking these rules. Then we'll avoid doing it. This is how the anti-child labourer system happened in Britain. Many factory owners wanted to stop employing children, but they felt it would put them out of business because their competitors were employing children. So they actually pressurized Parliament to put these laws in place against child laboring and to hire and pay for inspectors. So I think sometimes developers do want regulations, but sorry, Rohit.
I'm talking about the individual, if you like, the base level coders and data analysts. Exactly from a company point of view, I think there is this sense that we want to maximize profits, but we also want to be on the side of the angels. We don't want to suddenly be shut down because we're doing things wrong, and we don't want society turning against us. But what we've seen is lots of attempts under different labels over the last 7 or 8 years of corporations coming together and saying, let's set up a new set of rules, a new set of 19 rules or 87 principles or the 4,000 tenets of AI. And the common feature of all these things is they've largely been ignored in what those companies have gone on and done. And so there isn't a we really in evidence there. And then there's the we of governments and regulators who are very different. So what China's goals are very different to what the goals are of governments in the UAE or in other countries, or what Russia might be wanting to do, what we in the UK are looking at. And so I think, I'm not sure we do the conversation a service by talking about a we. I think we need to move the conversation into a space of saying, how do you hear multiple voices in this? And how do you allow those voices to feel like they're being heard, even if you then don't move forward, even if the kind of regulatory frameworks and the moral frameworks don't actually reflect all of those voices? We need to start to bring them in, and we need to start to bring them in fast, because we've got technologies like GPT-3 hitting the mass market, and we'll see a lot more AI tools embedded in everyday life. And the risk is we'll have got so used to it and so dependent on it at the point where we suddenly realize that we need some sort of moral guidance, some sort of regulatory framework around it. And then we collectively will be in deep doo-doo.
Well, deep doo-doo, and we're almost out of time. At least we're almost out of time in the formal part of the meeting. Some of us will probably hang around afterwards. So once the next few points are made, I'll come to Bronwyn in a minute, and then I'll come to Dan for basically concluding remarks, following on what Rohit just said. Once that's finished, we probably will take a 7-minute break or so, and people will probably mainly leave, but there's so many good points in the chat which some of you may wish to stay around and present them in a mode in which I will let everybody have the microphone, although I will ask you to not speak more than 2 minutes at a time, which is hard because I speak much more than 2 minutes at a time myself. But anyway, so that's what's coming next. But Bronwyn, what would you like to wind up with in terms of some of the threads that are bouncing around?
Yeah, I don't know. I think following on from the general debate here tonight is just how much impact we have as futurists and talking heads and people that I tend to be in the information sharing space rather than in the actual pinnacles of power out there. And I think that one of the things that we can do is just to be very direct and very articulate about the likely scenarios that are ahead of us without sort of pussyfooting around people's feelings and withholding certain details and some of those things that can be scary or shocking, because we tend to do that, right? We try to sort of sugarcoat these things. I know that you almost get bullied into it, particularly if you're giving keynotes or you're doing workshops or you're with people. You tend to sort of soften the edges when we have conversations around these sorts of issues. And I think that we need to be respectful of other people's actual human intelligence and put the actual ideas that are being debated right at the edges onto the table when we have these conversations. Let's be frank, let's be honest, and then let's put together a plan of action of either surrender or attack, which is basically what we're talking about now, both in the midterm in terms of surrender or attack, depending on whether you're on the regulator side or the innovator side, or whether you're coming from a Western worldview or from a particular nation state's point of view as to what should be happening in the interim. And then also from a more collective human perspective, in that international battle that's going to be taking place over and really shaping the next few years or decades is only the sort of first step, right? Thereafter, this all gets out of hand quite quickly. So how honest have we been about what's likely to happen, what could happen, and what our actual influence is upon these spheres? What can we control? What can't we control? And we need to stop kidding ourselves that we can control everything, because clearly we can't. We can't control our neighbors, and we certainly can't control the longer term trajectory of this entirely. But can we nudge it? Can we influence it? I'm quite optimistic that yes, we can, and we absolutely should, and we should use whatever influence we have to climb as far up whichever towers we can go so far as to gain access to while we still have an opportunity to do so.
So if we want a good conversation, a better conversation, we have to be honest. We shouldn't hide things. It's a bit like doctors sometimes used to avoid telling people they had cancer, because, well, it's too scary and there's nothing can be done. And some people have said, don't talk about the terrible things that the future AI may do, because there's nothing we can do about it, and you'll scare people. Whereas I think I'm with the camp that says, let's inform people, and there may be surprisingly interesting solutions coming up from sources we didn't expect. Dan, closing remarks.
Yeah, I would definitely concur on being frank. I've tried to do so myself in terms of my positions around what the ultimate goal of this stuff I think is going to turn into, whether we want it to or not. Things attenuate, including, you know, Homo sapiens. To the point of your last question that you brought up, David, yeah, by all means, the let it rip mentality, I think, can be horribly irresponsible. I think for two reasons. Number one, disregarding the sentience of the most sentient thing we know of, at least currently, which is humans, I think is a big ill, you know, to blatantly cast that aside. But also rolling the dice in a way that risks Armageddon and the dissimulation of life itself, and not permitting grander blooming, I think is also horribly irresponsible. So to that point, David, I think the where and how of the baton handoff is a big question. Let it not be rushed. I've never been an advocate for that. I think ultimately we bubbled from stuff we were not. Other stuff will bubble forth. Good. But by no means should that involve malice or overt destruction today. So when and how that transition happens, that all has to do with that light nudging and influencing that Bronwyn has optimism about, and that I hope to conjure more optimism about in my own life. I think in terms of ending point here, we've brought up sort of who has the influence. We've brought up what is actually going to set the trajectory. And I think the reason we've been able to say, you know, thinkers, economists, and ultimately lead back to those people having to influence either the real innovators or the real regulators is because I think we implicitly believe in the last words of Alexander, which were when he was on his deathbed, you know, having conquered, you know, more than what was known of the world at the time of his birth, with no successors. And they said, to whom should we give the kingdom? He was purported to have said, to the strongest, and then to have died. And I think that we happen to know that that might always be the case. Yeah, we should buckle up and sort of prepare to influence either of those two pillars.
So you've just quoted one of your own blog post articles, which is fine. I want to recommend people should track down, is it danfaggella.com? Your blog posts, which are fascinating.
Bronwyn's one of the 3 readers of my blog of all time, but yeah.
But there's a lot more there which deserves attention.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate
What
that.
we're saying is that we should help society work out the credible scenarios for transition, and we should explore these scenarios. And it may be that things that initially seem bleak could turn out to be better, and things that initially seem positive may turn out to be destructive. So let's improve this work to explore these scenarios for the future, types of possible future existence. Thanks to all 3 of you for stretching onto an awkward area, for putting up with criticisms. We haven't covered anything like all the points in the chat. There are lots of pertinent, insightful comments there. We might get to some of them in the informal area shortly, but thanks to the 3 of you, and let's wind this up.